I'll expand Part 1 to 600 words using simple English and keeping it engaging. Hannah pressed her back against the cold metal trash container, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows behind Kim's diner. Her skin, which should have glowed, with soft blue and purple patterns like a living galaxy, barely flickered now. The beautiful bioluminescent markings that covered her arms and face had grown dim over the past 3 days without proper food. She looked like a dying star. The atmospheric converter in her hands felt heavy, even though it was completely empty. The small device that kept her alive in human environments had run out of the special gas mixture her people needed to breathe. Without it, the oxygen-rich air that humans loved would slowly poison her lungs. She had maybe 6 hours left before her body would start shutting down. Rain drummed against the diner's windows, creating rivers of water that blurred her view inside. But she could still see them, the humans, sitting at their tables, laughing and talking. What amazed her most was how they shared food without any formal agreements or payment contracts. One human would slide half his sandwich to another. A woman would offer her soup to a friend who looked tired. They did this naturally, like breathing. This was completely alien to Hannah's understanding of how civilized beings should behave. Her people, the Velthari, never gave anything without getting something equal in return. Every transaction was carefully measured. Every favor required immediate payment. The idea of freely sharing resources seemed wasteful and dangerous to her species, but watching these humans, she began to wonder if maybe her people had gotten it wrong. The diner door chimed, and Hannah's heart jumped. A big human man stepped out, into the rain. He was built like the cargo haulers she'd seen at the station docks, broad shoulders, strong arms, wearing a worn jacket that had seen many trips between the stars. His face looked tired, but kind. This was her chance. Her only chance. Hannah forced herself to stand on legs that shook from hunger and fear. Every step toward the human felt like walking through thick mud. Her pride screamed at her to stop, to find another way, but there was no other way. She had already sold everything she owned. She had begged at every office and aid station on the station. No one wanted to help a Velthari refugee. The man was walking toward his transport when she stepped into his path. He stopped, surprised to see her emerge from the shadows. Up close, she could see lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent traveling the dangerous routes between planets. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Her translator device helped convert her words into standard, the common language used across human space, but her accent made her sound broken and desperate. She gestured weakly at her thin body, at the way her once beautiful skin had lost its glow. "I can—" The words stuck in her throat. This went against everything her people believed in, everything she had been taught about dignity and proper behavior. But dignity wouldn't keep her alive. "I can serve you for food." She kept her eyes down, unable to look at his face. She expected him to either take advantage of her offer or walk away in disgust. Those were the only 2 responses she had seen from other species when refugees like her became desperate enough to offer the only thing they had left. What she didn't expect was silence, followed by the gentle sound of footsteps coming closer. Instead of walking away, Doyen stopped walking so suddenly that his boots skidded on the wet pavement. For a moment, he just stared at the alien girl in front of him, trying to process what she had just said. In his 20 years of hauling cargo between planets, he had seen all kinds of desperate people. He had watched families sell their last possessions for passage off dying worlds. He had seen refugees fight over scraps of food in station corridors. But this was different. This young creature was offering herself, her body, just for a meal. The thought made his stomach turn, not because she was alien, but because no living being should ever have to make that choice. His weathered face, marked by years of cosmic radiation and hard living, went through several expressions. First confusion. Had his translator device worked correctly? Then understanding as he realized what she meant. Finally, his features settled into something that looked like anger, but not at her. At whatever circumstances had brought her to this point, Doyen had served in the Human Defense Corps before becoming a trucker. He had fought in border skirmishes and seen the aftermath of corporate wars that left entire species homeless. But Somehow, standing in the rain looking at this starving girl, he felt angrier than he had in any battle. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. "That's not how this works." Before Hana could react or run away, Doyun reached out and gently took her arm. Not roughly, not like someone claiming property, but the way someone might guide a lost child. His touch was warm and careful, treating her like she was fragile and valuable. "Come on," he said, steering her toward the diner's entrance. "You're going to sit down and eat like a normal person." The warmth hit Hana like a physical force as they stepped inside Kim's diner. After hours in the cold rain, the heated air felt almost too intense. The smell of cooked food made her empty stomach cramp with hunger so sharp it was almost painful. The diner wasn't fancy. Worn plastic booths lined the walls, and the floor had scuff marks from thousands of workers' boots. But it was clean and bright, and the humans inside looked up with mild curiosity rather than hostility when they entered. Doyun guided her to an empty booth near the back and practically pushed her into the seat. "Sit," he said simply, as if talking to someone who might collapse at any moment, which honestly wasn't far from the truth. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers once. Across the diner, a middle-aged human man looked up from behind the counter. This had to be Kim, the owner. Doyun jerked his head toward their table, and Kim nodded immediately. Within minutes, Kim himself was walking over with a plate that made Hana's eyes widen. Steaming protein synthesis shaped to look like real meat, vegetables that had been grown in the station's hydroponics bays, and bread that was still warm from the oven. The portions were generous, enough to feed her for 2 days if she rationed it carefully, but Doyun wasn't asking her to ration anything. "Eat," he said, sliding the plate in front of her. Hana stared at the food, then at him, then back at the food. Her hands shook as she picked up the utensils. She had been preparing to sell her dignity for scraps, and instead this human had given her a feast with no conditions attached. The first bite hit her system like electricity. Her body, starved for days, responded immediately. She tried to eat, slowly, to maintain some dignity, but hunger took over. Soon she was eating with desperate speed, tears streaming down her face without her realizing it. Between bites, she tried to explain in broken standard why she was here, where she came from, what had happened to her world. Doyun listened patiently, occasionally asking Kim to turn up the translator volume when her accent got too thick, and slowly, as warmth and food filled her body, Hana began to understand that maybe humans really were as strange as the stories claimed. Jiho wiped his hands on his apron and pulled up a chair next to their booth. The diner owner was a stocky man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen plenty of hard times. He poured himself a cup of coffee and settled in to listen as Hana told her story between bites of food. Her words came out in broken pieces, mixed with tears and frustration as the translator struggled with her accent. But the story that emerged made both men's faces grow darker with each detail. Hana's homeworld, Velthara Prime, had been rich in rare minerals that human corporations needed for their faster-than-light engines. The mining rights had been purchased legally, or so the paperwork claimed, but the extraction process had poisoned the atmosphere so quickly that her people barely had time to evacuate. "They said we could come back in 50 years when the air cleared," Hana whispered, staring at her empty plate. "But our scientists know the truth. The damage is permanent. Our world is dead." Millions of Velthari had scattered across the galaxy, looking for places that would accept refugees. Most colonies saw them as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. They were given minimal resources and told to figure out survival on their own. Jiho shook his head slowly. "Corporate mining operations," he muttered. "Same story, different planet. They did something similar to the asteroid belt where my grandfather worked." Doyun was already pulling out his comm device, scrolling through his contact list. "We need to get your atmospheric converter fixed first," he said to Hana. "How long did you say before the air becomes toxic?" Hana glanced at her wrist display, which showed her blood oxygen levels. "Maybe 4 hours now." "Right." Doyun found the contact he was looking for and hit the call button. The device chimed once before a voice answered. "Minjun here. What's the emergency, Doyun?" I've got a Velthari refugee whose atmospheric converter is dead. How fast can you get to Kim's diner? There was a pause. Velthari. Those are the people. Whose planet got mined to death, right? Poor kid, I'm 15 minutes away. Tell them to hang on. Doyen ended the call and immediately started dialing another number. This time he reached Beomsyok, a man who owned several small apartments near the docks. Workers like Doyen often rented rooms there between cargo runs. Beomsyok, I need a favor. I've got a refugee who needs a place to stay for a while. Human or alien? Alien. Velthari, she's got nothing. How long? I don't know. However long it takes. There was no hesitation. Unit 23B is empty. I'll have the key ready in an hour. No deposit needed. While Doyen made his calls, Jiho was already on his own comm device, talking to someone at the station's social services office. Yung Kyung, it's Jiho from the diner. I've got a refugee situation here. Yes, Velthari. No, she doesn't have proper documentation. Can you come down here? Hana watched all this activity with growing amazement. These humans were talking about her like she was their responsibility, like helping her was the most natural thing in the world. In her culture, strangers only helped if they expected payment or future favors. But these people seemed to be organizing assistance without even discussing what they would get in return. Minjun arrived first, carrying a toolbox that looked older than Hana herself. He was a thin man, with work-stained hands and a gentle smile. "Let me see that converter," he said, settling down at their table like he had all the time in the world. As he worked on the device, more people started arriving. Hyun Kyung, the social worker, brought forms and a tablet computer. Beomsyok showed up with apartment keys and a bag of basic supplies. Each person Doyun had called brought someone else who might be able to help. Within 2 hours, Hana found herself surrounded by 8 humans who had never met her before today. They had fixed her converter, found her housing, started her paperwork for refugee status, and even collected enough credits to cover her basic needs for the next month. "Why?" she finally asked, looking around the table at all these faces. "Why are you doing this? I cannot pay you back." Jiho shrugged. "Because you need help and we can help, that's reason enough." It was the simplest answer anyone had ever given her, and also the most revolutionary thing she had ever heard. Hana stood in the doorway of apartment 23B, holding the key Beomsyok had given her. The space was small but spotlessly clean, with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchen area. Sunlight streamed through a window that looked out over the station's central plaza. After sleeping behind trash containers for 3 days, it felt like a palace. But what made her stop breathing for a moment was the basket sitting on the table. It was woven from some kind of plant fiber and filled with items she couldn't immediately identify. A note was attached to the handle, written in careful standard, "Welcome to Building 23 from your neighbors in 23A." Hana had never met anyone in 23A. She didn't even know their names. Yet here was a basket full of what appeared to be gifts. She approached it like it might explode. In Velthari culture, unexpected gifts were usually traps. Someone wanted something from you, and they were starting the negotiation with an opening offer. The proper response was to carefully examine the gifts, calculate their value, and then figure out what equivalent payment was expected. But as she examined the contents, nothing made sense. There were packets of food, not expensive delicacies, but simple things like instant soup and protein bars, a small plant in a pot that didn't seem to serve any practical purpose except looking nice, some kind of soft fabric that might be for cleaning, and strangest of all, a small electronic device. With another note, "Thought this might help, Harim 23C. Hana turned the device on and nearly dropped it. It was a language learning program, loaded with Velthari to standard translation modules that must have cost a significant amount of credits. This wasn't some cheap throwaway gift. This was expensive software that would genuinely help her integrate into human society. A soft knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find a young human woman about her own age, holding a steaming cup of something that smelled wonderful. "Hi," the woman said with a bright smile. "I'm Harim from 23C. I heard you moved in today. Thought you might like some tea." Hana stared at her. "You gave me the translation software." "Oh, you found it? Great. I hope it helps. I'm studying xenolinguistics at the Station University, so I had access to the good programs. Harim held out the cup. This is chamomile tea. It's supposed to be relaxing. What do you want? Hana asked bluntly. Harim blinked in confusion. Want? I don't want anything. I just thought you might be stressed from moving and could use something warm to drink. But you gave me expensive software. You brought me tea. You must want something. In return. The confusion on Harim's face deepened. I mean, I guess if you ever want to practice conversation in standard, that would be fun. But you don't have to. I just thought you might need help settling in. Before Hana could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was an elderly human man with silver hair and hands that looked like they had built half the station. You must be the new tenant, he said with a warm smile. I'm Gunwoo from 23F. Brought you some tools in case your atmospheric unit starts acting up. He held out a small toolkit that contained everything needed for basic atmospheric converter maintenance. Hana recognized equipment that would cost her a month's wages if she had to buy it herself. I cannot afford to pay for this, she said immediately. Gunwoo looked genuinely puzzled. Pay for what? These are just spare tools. I've got more than I need. He stepped into her apartment and walked over to her atmospheric converter. Mind if I show you how to do basic maintenance? These units can be tricky if you don't know their quirks. For the next hour, Gunwoo patiently explained how to clean filters, check gas mixture levels, and spot early warning signs of mechanical problems. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't suggest future favors. He just taught her everything she needed to know to keep herself alive. When he finished, Hana tried again to negotiate some kind of payment arrangement. I could work for you, or provide services, or pay you back over time. Gunwoo scratched his head. Work for me doing what? I'm retired, and what services? You just moved in. He seemed genuinely confused by her insistence on formal transactions. Look, kid, sometimes people just help each other because it's the right thing to do, no contracts needed. After he left, Hana sat on her new bed and stared at the toolkit, the translation software, the gift basket, and the cup of tea that was still warm in her hands. Everything she had been taught about civilized interaction was wrong. These humans were operating on principles that made no economic sense, but somehow worked better than anything she had ever experienced. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Hana's first day at Kim's Diner started at 5 in the morning, when the early shift workers began filtering in for breakfast. Jiho had offered her a job without even asking about her experience. You need work, I need help, he had said simply. We'll figure out the details as we go. Yuri, the morning waitress, took Hana under her wing immediately. She was a cheerful woman in her 30s with laugh lines around her eyes and an endless supply of patience for Hana's questions. See that trucker at table 4, Yuri whispered as they stood behind the counter. He orders the same thing every day, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, but watch what happens when I bring his check. Hana watched as Yuri delivered the bill. The trucker looked at it, then pulled out enough credits to cover his meal plus 50% extra. He left the extra money on the table and walked out without saying anything about it. That extra money is called a tip, Yuri explained. It's how customers show appreciation for good service. But here's the interesting part. He doesn't have to give it. No law requires it. No contract demands it. He does it because he thinks I did a good job. This concept made Hana's head spin. In Velthari society, payment was precisely calculated based on exact value received. The idea of voluntary additional payment for subjective satisfaction was completely foreign. But what if he doesn't tip? Hana asked. Yuri shrugged. Then he doesn't. Some people tip well, others don't tip at all. It usually evens out. She smiled. Besides, Jiho pays us a fair wage whether we get tips or not. The tips are just extra. In the kitchen, Nari was already working on the lunch prep. The cook was a sturdy woman with silver-streaked hair who had been feeding hungry workers for 15 years. When she learned about Hana's dietary restrictions, she didn't complain about the extra work. Velthari can't process certain proteins, right? Nari asked, consulting notes she had written on her tablet. And you need higher mineral content than humans? Hana nodded, expecting to be told she would have to bring her own food. Instead, Nari handed her a plate of modified vegetable stir-fry. Try this. I adjusted the seasoning blend and added mineral supplements. Let me know if the flavor works. The food was delicious, better than anything Hana had eaten since leaving her homeworld. But what amazed her was that Nari had spent her own time researching Velthari nutrition and developing new recipes just for one employee. "Why did you do this?" Hana asked. Nari looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because you work here, you need to eat, so I make food you can eat. That's just common sense." As the days passed, Hana witnessed behavior that challenged everything she thought she knew about civilized interaction. She watched a customer at table 6 quietly pay for the meal of a family at table 2, a family he had never met. When she asked Yuri about it, the waitress explained that the customer had overheard the family discussing whether they could afford dessert for their child's birthday. He wanted to help, but didn't want to embarrass them, Yuri said, so he paid their bill anonymously and left before they found out. Even more confusing was how the workers treated each other. When Yuri came down with flu, 3 other waitresses immediately volunteered to cover her shifts. They didn't expect extra pay or future favors. They just rearranged their schedules to help a colleague. When Nari's grandmother was hospitalized, Jiho gave her 2 weeks off with full pay to be with family. He hired temporary help and absorbed the extra costs without complaint. "But what if everyone gets sick at the same time?" Hana asked Jiho. "What if helping others costs more than you can afford?" Jiho was cleaning glasses behind the counter, moving, with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this work for decades. "Then we figure it out," he said simply. "Maybe we close for a day. Maybe we ask customers to be patient with slower service. People understand that emergencies happen." The most shocking incident happened during Hana's second week. A Terran family, 2 parents and 3 young children, came in for dinner. They ordered carefully, choosing the cheapest items on the menu. When their bill came, Hana overheard the father quietly tell his wife that they were 20 credits short. Hana expected them to remove items from their order or negotiate a payment plan. Instead, she watched Jiho walk over to their table, tear up their bill, and tell them their meal was on the house. Because they were his 100th customers that day, it was obviously a lie. Hana had been counting. They were customer number 47. "Why did you do that?" she asked him later. Jiho shrugged. "They were hungry. I had food. Problem solved. But you lost money. I fed a family. That's not losing. That's what restaurants are supposed to do." Slowly, Hana began to understand that these weren't random acts of charity. This was how humans had built a society that actually worked. Every night after her shift at Kim's diner, Hana would sit in her small apartment and type reports on her tablet. At first, she wasn't even sure why she was documenting her experiences. The behavior she witnessed daily was so different from everything she had been taught about civilized society that she felt compelled to record it, like a scientist studying a new species. Her first report was simple. Humans give away food for free, not expired food or leftovers, but fresh meals to people who cannot pay. This behavior appears to be widespread and accepted as normal. She sent it through encrypted channels to her cousin Keth, who had ended up in a Velthari refugee camp on the other side of the galaxy. His response came back within hours. "That makes no sense. They must expect something in return. Keep watching for the real transaction." But as weeks passed, Hana never saw the real transaction. The humans at the diner continued their inexplicable generosity without ever collecting debts or calling in favors. Her reports grew longer and more detailed. Observation Day 23. A human customer paid for medicine for another customer's sick child. The 2 humans had never met before. The paying customer left immediately after the transaction and did not provide contact information for future repayment. The recipient was not asked to sign any agreement or provide collateral. Hajun found her through the refugee network 3 weeks into her documentation project. He was a Velthari who had been studying human society for years, trying to understand why refugee integration was so much more successful in human communities than anywhere else. "Your reports are causing quite a stir," he told her during their first encrypted video call. "Half the refugee councils think you're making it up." Hajun was older than Hana, with the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too many of his people suffer in poorly managed refugee camps. He had been working as an advocate for displaced Velthari across 3 sectors, trying to negotiate better conditions and resources. "I need you to be more systematic," he continued. "Document everything: times, dates, estimated monetary values, frequency of occurrence. If humans really operate this way, we need to understand how it works." Together, they established a formal observation protocol. Hana would record not just individual acts of generosity, but patterns of behavior, social structures, and economic outcomes. Hajun helped her set up secure communication networks to share her findings with refugee communities across the galaxy. Her reports began to paint a picture that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization itself. Week 6. Summary: Human. Establishments frequently operate at a loss on individual transactions, while maintaining overall profitability through community loyalty and repeat business. Customer retention appears linked to emotional satisfaction rather than purely economic calculation. Week 8. Summary: Humans regularly sacrifice individual advantage for group benefit. Workers cover for sick colleagues without compensation. Customers recommend competitors if they believe the competitor better serves the customer's needs. This behavior correlates with higher overall community prosperity. The responses from other refugee communities grew heated. Traditional Velthari economists declared her observations impossible. "No society can survive by giving away resources without precise reciprocal agreements," wrote one respected academic. "Your humans must be hiding their true economic structure." But reports from other observers began trickling in. A Velthari mechanic on Station Proxima confirmed similar patterns. A refugee family on the agricultural world of New Terra reported that human farmers regularly shared equipment and labor, without formal contracts. More intriguingly, refugee communities that tried to adopt human-style mutual aid reported dramatic improvements in living conditions. A camp on Kepler 9 that started sharing resources freely saw their suicide rate drop by 60% in 3 months. "The humans appear to have discovered something we missed," Hajun told her during one of their weekly calls. "Communities that prioritize collective welfare over individual profit don't just survive, they thrive." But the reports also generated fierce resistance. Traditional Velthari leaders warned that adopting human customs would lead to economic collapse and social chaos. "These practices violate the fundamental principles of civilized exchange," declared the Refugee Council of Elders. "We must maintain our cultural integrity." Hana found herself at the center of a philosophical battle that was splitting refugee communities across the galaxy. Some groups began experimenting with human-style cooperation. Others doubled down on traditional transactional relationships. The strangest part was that humans themselves seemed completely unaware of how revolutionary their behavior was. When Hana tried to explain the controversy her reports had caused, Jiho just looked confused. "People taking care of each other is controversial?" he asked, wiping down the diner counter. "What else would we do?" That simple question kept Hana awake at night. What else, indeed? Myung stared at the data pad displaying Hana's latest report, his engineering mind struggling to process what he was reading. As the unofficial leader of the Velthari refugee settlement on mining station Omega-7, he was responsible for 43 families crammed into converted storage units. Resources were tight, tensions were high, and every week brought new problems that seemed impossible to solve. The settlement operated exactly as Velthari tradition demanded. When new refugees arrived, they were given basic orientation and told to find their own housing and employment. Resources were distributed based on strict calculations of need and ability to pay. Help was provided only through formal agreements with clearly defined repayment terms. It wasn't working. Families hoarded what little they had, afraid to share in case they didn't receive equal value in return. New arrivals often failed to integrate, creating a permanent underclass of desperate individuals. Stress-related illnesses were common, productivity was low, and relations with their human neighbors ranged from indifferent to hostile. But according to Hana's reports, Human communities operated on completely different principles, and somehow they worked better. Myung called a meeting of the settlement's family representatives. In the cramped community room, surrounded by 43 tired faces, he presented Hana's findings. She claims that human settlements provide immediate assistance to new arrivals without demanding payment or contracts, he said, reading from his tablet. Housing, food, employment assistance, and integration support are provided freely, based only on need. Elder Vash, who had led their evacuation from Velthara Prime, shook his head vigorously. Impossible! No community can survive such wasteful practices. These humans must be deceiving her. But what if they're not? Asked Kira, a young mother whose child had been sick for weeks. What if there's something we're missing? The debate that followed was heated. Traditional voices argued that abandoning proven Velthari practices would lead to chaos and exploitation. Progressive voices pointed out that their current system wasn't exactly thriving. Myung made the decision that would change everything. We're going to try it. For 1 month, we'll provide unconditional assistance to any new arrivals. No contracts, no payment requirements, no formal obligations. The first test came 3 days later, when a transport ship arrived carrying 7 Velthari refugees who had fled another failed settlement. Under the old system, they would have been given a brief orientation and told to figure out survival on their own. Instead, Myung organized the entire settlement to help. Families volunteered spare bedding and clothes. The communal kitchen expanded. Operations to feed 7 more people. Employment specialists worked overtime to find jobs for the newcomers. Housing was provided immediately, with rent subsidized by voluntary contributions from established families. The results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of the usual weeks of struggle and gradual integration, the new arrivals were productive members of the community within days. More importantly, the act of helping others seemed to energize the entire settlement. People who had been focused on their own survival suddenly found themselves working together toward common goals. Stress levels, which had been climbing steadily, for months began to drop. Dr. Chaewon, a human anthropologist who had been studying refugee integration patterns across the sector, noticed the change during her regular visits. Something's different here, she told Myung during a routine interview. Your people seem happier, more relaxed. What changed? Myung explained their new approach, expecting skepticism. Instead, Chaewon pulled out her own data pad and began taking rapid notes. This is fascinating, she said. You've essentially replicated the mutual aid networks that make human communities so resilient. I've been tracking refugee settlements across 12 stations, and the ones that adopt these practices consistently outperform traditional models. She showed him her data. Settlements using human-style mutual aid reported lower rates of depression, higher employment rates, better relationships with host communities, and significantly lower crime rates. Children in these communities performed better in school and showed fewer signs of trauma-related stress. The traditional economic models assume that resources are finite and must be carefully guarded, Chaewon explained. But human communities operate on the principle that shared resources multiply rather than diminish. When everyone contributes what they can and takes what they need, the total available resources actually increase. As word of their success spread, Myung began receiving communications from other Velthari settlements. Some were curious, asking for detailed explanations of their new system. Others were critical, warning that they were betraying their cultural heritage. But the numbers didn't lie. Within 3 months, their settlement had become the most successful Velthari community in the sector. Productivity was up 40%. Health indicators had improved across all age groups. Most remarkably, their human neighbors had begun actively seeking partnership opportunities instead of merely tolerating their presence. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some individuals tried to take advantage of the free assistance without contributing anything in return. But, surprisingly, these problems solved themselves through community pressure rather than formal enforcement. When someone consistently took without giving, other community members would have quiet conversations with them. Most adjusted their behavior quickly. It's like the humans have been trying to teach us something all along, Myung told Chaewon, during one of their regular check-ins. We just weren't listening. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other refugee communities began sending representatives to observe their methods. Human settlements started specifically requesting Velthari refugees who had been trained in their community model. And somewhere across the galaxy, Hana continued documenting the quiet revolution that was transforming how entire species thought about civilization itself. The message arrived on Hana's personal communicator during the evening rush at Kim's diner. She was carrying a tray of steaming bowls to a table of freight workers when her device chimed with an official priority signal. The sender's credentials made her nearly drop the entire tray. Galactic Refugee Council, Central Administration. Council. Representative Yunseo requests immediate conference regarding your integration research documentation. Priority classification, sector-wide policy review. Hana stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. Her informal reports to other refugee communities had somehow reached the highest levels of galactic government. This could be very good news or very bad news. The video conference was scheduled for the next day. Yunseo appeared on Hana's tablet, screen as a sharp-eyed Andromedan with the kind of professional demeanor that came from years of dealing with complex, bureaucratic problems. Behind her, Hana could see the sprawling offices of the Council's headquarters on Nexus Prime. "Your documentation has caused quite a stir," Yunseo said without preamble. "We've received reports from 17 different refugee settlements claiming that adopting human community practices has dramatically improved their outcomes. We need to verify these claims." What followed was the most intense interview of Hana's life. Yunseo asked for specific data, statistical breakdowns, and detailed explanations of every behavioral pattern Hana had observed. She wanted to know how resources were distributed, how conflicts were resolved, and how these communities maintained stability without formal enforcement mechanisms. "The numbers we're seeing don't match our economic models," Yunseo explained. "Communities that should be failing according to traditional resource management theory are actually outperforming settlements with more resources and better formal structures." Hana found herself explaining concepts that seemed obvious to her, now but had once been completely alien. She described how humans shared risk collectively, how they invested in each other's success without expecting immediate returns, and how they treated community welfare as a form of individual insurance. "It's not charity," she emphasized. "It's strategic. When everyone in a community is stable and productive, everyone benefits. When people are desperate and struggling, everyone suffers." Humans understood this instinctively. The Council commissioned formal studies involving 12 different refugee settlements across 3 sectors. Half would continue operating under traditional resource management protocols. Half would adopt human-style mutual aid models. The results would be tracked over 6 months using standardized metrics for economic output, social stability, health outcomes, and integration success. Dr. Jaehwon was brought in as the lead researcher, her previous work with Myung's settlement, providing valuable baseline data. The study became the largest comparative analysis of community management strategies ever conducted by the Galactic Council. The results were so dramatic that the initial reports were questioned and rechecked multiple times. Communities using human-style mutual aid showed 47% lower crime rates, 32% higher employment rates, and 61% better scores on psychological wellness assessments. Children in these communities performed significantly better in educational programs and showed fewer signs of trauma-related behavioral problems. Perhaps most importantly, these communities integrated with their host populations at rates nearly triple those of traditional settlements. Human neighbors actively sought partnerships and friendships with refugees who had been trained in cooperative community models. The data caught the attention of Sang, a veteran station administrator who had been struggling with refugee management issues for over a decade. His station, a major trade hub near the border territories, processed thousands of displaced beings every year. Traditional integration programs had success rates below 30%. "We're implementing these protocols station-wide," Sang announced during a council briefing that Hana was invited to attend virtually. "Not just for refugees, but for all new residents. The evidence is overwhelming. The new policies represented a fundamental shift in how galactic authorities approached community management. Instead of focusing on resource allocation and formal legal structures, the emphasis moved to building social networks and mutual support systems. New arrival centers were redesigned to facilitate relationship building rather than just processing paperwork. Established residents were trained to serve as community mentors. Housing was distributed to promote interaction between different species and cultural groups, rather than segregating them into ethnic enclaves. The changes weren't without controversy. Traditional economists warned that these policies would lead to resource depletion and exploitation. Some species argued that adopting human customs violated their cultural integrity, but the results spoke for themselves. Stations implementing human-style community protocols showed dramatic improvements in social stability, economic productivity, and interspecies cooperation. 6 months after that first priority message, Hannah found herself testifying before the full Galactic Council. The chamber was filled with representatives from hundreds of species, all trying to understand how a single species approach to community building could transform galactic civilization. "The humans didn't invent cooperation," she said, standing at the central podium as her words were translated into dozens of languages. "They just never forgot that individual survival depends on community survival. They made it automatic, instinctive, part of their daily behavior." She looked out at the assembled delegates, thinking about all the refugees still struggling in poorly managed camps across the galaxy. The question isn't whether we can afford to adopt these practices. The question is whether we can afford not to. The Great Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had never hosted a Velthari ambassador before. As Hannah walked down the central aisle toward the speaker's podium, she could feel thousands of eyes from dozens of species watching her every step. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin glowed steady and bright, a far cry from the dim, dying flickers she had shown 2 years ago behind Kim's diner. She wore the formal robes of a galactic ambassador, but underneath them was a simple pendant, a small piece of metal that Gunwu had given her, cut from the atmospheric converter he had taught her to repair. It reminded her of where this journey had started. The assembly hall fell silent as she reached the podium. Representatives from the Andromedan Trade Federation sat next to delegates from the Crystalline Collective. Military leaders from warrior species shared seating areas with peaceful agricultural worlds. All of them were here to hear about something that had started with a desperate alien girl offering herself for a meal. 2 years ago I was dying," Hannah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's amplification system. "Not from disease or injury, but from something more common in our galaxy. I was dying from isolation, from a system that treated survival as an individual responsibility rather than a community obligation." She clicked a control, and holographic displays throughout the hall showed statistical data from the past 24 months. Crime rates, economic productivity, health indicators, and integration success rates from hundreds of settlements across 3 sectors. "These numbers tell a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about civilization," she continued. "Communities that adopted human-style mutual aid didn't just survive, they thrived in ways our economic models said were impossible." The data was overwhelming. Refugee settlements using human community principles showed improvements across every measurable category. But more than that, entire star systems had begun adopting these practices for their general populations. The Kepler sector had redesigned their entire approach to colonial development. Instead of establishing settlements based on resource extraction efficiency, they now prioritized community relationship building. The results had exceeded all projections. Productivity was up, crime was down, and interspecies conflicts had virtually disappeared. "But this isn't really about economics or politics," Hannah said, advancing to her next set of data. "This is about what happens when you treat every individual's welfare as connected to everyone else's welfare." She told them about Jiho, who still ran Kim's diner and still quietly paid for meals when families couldn't afford them. About Yuri, who had helped train dozens of refugee workers in customer service. About Nari, whose adapted recipes had become standard in refugee integration centers across the galaxy. "Humans don't see helping others as charity," she explained. They see it as insurance. When your neighbor is stable and successful, your community is stronger. When your community is stronger, you are safer. The presentation included video testimonials from settlement leaders across the galaxy. Myung, whose engineering background had helped him quantify the improvements in his community, spoke about productivity, increases that seemed impossible under traditional models. Jaewon presented research showing that children raised in mutual aid communities showed better cognitive development and fewer psychological trauma symptoms. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, a human colony. Administrator named Commander Torres, whose settlement had been struggling with integration issues until they began learning from the refugee communities that had adopted their own practices. We had become so focused on formal procedures and legal frameworks that we forgot how to be neighbors, Torres said in the recorded message. The refugees taught us how to be human again. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the assembly. Human practices were being used to teach humans how to build better communities. Hana's presentation concluded with a proposal that had been years in the making. The Galactic Council would establish the Universal Community Integration Protocol, a standardized approach to settlement development based on human mutual aid principles. It wouldn't be mandatory, but communities that adopted these practices would receive priority status for trade agreements, resource allocation, and diplomatic support. We stand at a crossroads, Hana said, looking out at the assembled representatives. We can continue operating on the assumption that competition and individual advantage are the foundations of civilization. Or we can learn from a species that discovered something we missed, that cooperation isn't weakness, it's the ultimate survival strategy. The vote wasn't even close. 437 systems voted to adopt the new protocols. Only 18 voted against, and most of those abstained rather than actively opposing. As Hana left the podium, she thought about the strange path that had brought her here. She had offered her body for a meal, expecting to be exploited or rejected. Instead, she had discovered a way of life that was transforming galactic civilization. Later that evening, she called Kim's diner from her ambassador's quarters. Ji-ho answered as he always did. How did it go, he asked, as if she had just finished a job interview rather than reshaping the political structure of the galaxy. It went well, she said. I think people are starting to understand. Good, Ji-ho replied. That's what neighbors are for, helping each other understand things. And somehow, in that simple statement, he had captured the entire philosophical revolution that was slowly spreading across the stars.